Welcome everyone to this webinar on race, racism, our disciplines and institutions. In the wake of recent events and ongoing racially motivated violence, there have been many institutional responses to raise awareness of race and racism in the US and beyond. Geraldine Hang, a counselor of the Medieval Academy of America and author of The Invention of Race in the Middle Ages, suggested that the chair of the Academy's fairly new Inclusivity and Diversity Committee organize a series of webinars as a response. My name is Aphrodisia McCannon, and I am that chair. This second Medieval Academy webinar on race, racism, and medieval studies investigates race and racism as it appears in our disciplines and institutions, many of which were founded on explicitly racial grounds. The panel is designed to make us think about the structures which uphold bias practices, consider the effects of these practices on students, scholars, and scholarship of the Middle Ages, imagine ways forward, and enact potential subversions to institutionalized habits. I'd like to thank Geraldine for her suggestion, the four speakers who have graciously agreed to participate, the Medieval Academy for giving us this platform, and thank you all for joining us for this webinar, and wish you a happy new year, Shana Tova, if you are celebrating. Some nuts and bolts. After our speakers present, we'll have a Q&A period of questions sent in before and during the event. During the event, if you look in the chat box, there'll be a link that'll take you to the question form. This event is being recorded and the participants are fine with live tweeting. Without further ado, our first speaker is Nicole Lopez-Janssen. Dr. Nicole Lopez-Janssen is an associate professor of history at CUNY Borough of Manhattan Community College, where she teaches courses on pre-modern Mediterranean, modern European, and women's history. Dr. Lopez-Janssen received her doctorate in history from Fordham University in 2012, where she analyzed the struggle over Ravenna as part of a larger conflict over authority in the post-Roman West. Her recent research has focused on race, gender, and sexuality in early medieval Italy. In addition to a forthcoming article on sexuality, her article, Between Empires, Race and Ethnicity in the Early Middle Ages, was recently published in Literature Compass. She is also on the board of the Society for Medieval Feminist Scholarship. Her presentation is titled, Acknowledging Race as and the Race of Medieval Historians. Nicole, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank the Medieval Academy and Geraldine Hang for suggesting this, and Shana Tova to everyone who is celebrating. So first, in terms of my title, I want to really focus on undergraduate education and the importance of acknowledging that all of your students, and that includes your white students, go through life and the university as raced people. So it's important to note that colorblind politics failed because it was placed on top of these of systemic racist structures. And I will just plug Kimberly Crenshaw's book, Seeing Race Again, which is about exactly that, seeing race again in all of our disciplines. Sociologists have been speaking especially recently about this. So the structure, there are many structures of history as a discipline that discourage Black, Indigenous, and students of color from medieval studies at all levels. Like I said, I focus mainly on undergraduate education and really first and second year education. The American Historical Association published 3 years ago now an article with stats about history education in general, and what they found was that Black and Latinx students in particular had a disproportionately high level of rates of failing, withdrawing, getting incompletes, and Ds. So, basically not meeting that C level that you need to go on. And they looked specifically at American history, but I would imagine that, whatever introductory history, world history, or even worse, if for those of us who still have it, Western Civ, this is a major issue. And I will also say that I get many students who have failed in my colleagues' class. And this is anecdotal, but it's certainly an issue, and it's not the students. So if already at the introductory level courses, we have students who are failing, and you need to have a 2.0 for a university, that we can't even talk about getting students into history as a discipline, history as a major, if we're failing them out of introductory courses. It's a huge, huge problem. So, we have these really structural issues all throughout. So there are ways so we need to interrogate and address the history of our institutions and think about how they alienate our BIPOC students. Even so, just from New York City, there have been large struggles, thinking about the Ivies, about Columbia, about NYU, property struggles. How are you going to engage with your students, if you're trying to recruit BIPOC students when you are alienating the community and fighting specifically against the community? So there are also ethical issues to consider in recruiting students into the major. So just some things that I've been thinking about in particular. For those of us who are doing global late antique, global Middle Ages, which are great, one of the things to think about is, are all of your faculty in the program working on Europe? Are they all white? This is something that if that's the case, it's important to change. Yes, by hiring more faculty, but also drawing in faculty with adjacent interests. So if you have an early Ottoman historian, draw that person into your global Middle Ages. There are these issues that history students face at all levels, including macroaggressions, but also microaggressions as well. People don't ask white students and colleagues why they don't work on medieval, I don't know if they're of Italian heritage, why they're not working on Italy as opposed to England. But this is definitely something that happens with us. I've been asked, my family is from Nicaragua, why I don't work on medieval Spain, and that's kind of the nicest thing that's happened. But so if you're not going to do it to your white students, please don't do that to your students of color. So some things that I would just encourage is, in thinking about replicating institutions and replicating these systemic racism or trying to disrupt that, we have to be more willing to mentor into interdisciplinary work. Reproducing students that think and look like us is obviously not going to draw in, it's not going to change anything. So I've been thinking a lot recently about encouraging students' strengths from the beginning. And this ties back into what I was saying at the very beginning of, encouraging them, especially with their own languages. And this is really how you get a truly global Middle Ages. One of the things that I'm doing, I did it last semester, and we're still kind of working it out. But I've told students in my introductory history course that they can research in whatever languages they have available to them. They have to write the paper in English. I have to be able to read it, but they have strengths. My students who speak Arabic, my students who are Haitian and have French, who have Spanish, these are things that actually are strengths for them, and they are punished for it in our institutions. They have so much available already that they are just discouraged all the time from using. And I think it's something that's really important, is that this isn't a deficit. This is something that we should really encourage. And I know a lot of, I'm in CUNY, so a lot of people don't have as many international students, as many students of color in general, but it's also important for white students to hear this, that, you know, these languages and what these students are doing are not deficits. So when I went to grad school, there was a kind of joke about history education, about, you know, going into PhD programs. And the joke was that first they would throw out anyone who didn't have Latin to a certain level, and then they would throw out anyone who didn't have German to a certain level, and then French. And it's a joke, but it's also not, because that's essentially how a lot of it works. But for students who already have other languages, whether or not they're those languages that are really encouraged, you know, they have the facility to do it. Classics, especially right now, the University of Michigan, and just the other day I heard Cornell also has a Bridge MA program that specifically gives extra funding for students to do language study while at the same time doing the MA, with the idea of going into the PhD program. These are things that we can encourage for medieval studies. And I personally do think that students who have other languages, whether or not they're the languages that that you need for studying history, or that you're encouraged, because again, the language that I use the most is Italian, but that's not one of the languages that I did as my PhD language study. It's because it's just not, they have an advantage. So it's something that we should actually encourage all the way from the very, very beginning. Although I can't advise people to go to the University of Michigan right now, because they are punishing grad students for striking. Did want to say that. But in general, the idea of having these Bridge MA programs is a great idea. But again, and actually that brings me to my final major point, is that there are ethics of encouraging BIPOC students without addressing these larger structural issues. Because even if you and your department in particular want to make these changes, if the institution is not invested in the same way, you're setting them up not necessarily to fail, but to have hardships. Are they going to be supported by the wider university? And, you know, yes, of course, we can't all change everything all at once. I'm still pushing to change Western Civ as a course that's offered. I mean, I teach it the way I teach it, but, you know, yes, I will acknowledge that we still have it, even though I've been kind of pushing against it. But it is, in thinking about encouraging BIPOC students in general, one, I think it's really important to encourage them from the very, very beginning, encourage their strengths, because they do have strengths, but also at the same time to push against the university and against these systemic structures that, that really work against them, that you can't encourage BIPOC students without at the same time pushing against these racist structures. You know, we know how our discipline is. It's hard. It's hard out there. So one of the really big ways that to be an ally is to band with other people and really try and push these changes, you know, all the way up to the board of trustees. And of course, yes, I know it's easy, you know, it's easier to say that than actually do it, but you know, it is a long game. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Our next speaker is Roland Betancourt. Roland Betancourt is a professor of art history and Chancellor's Fellow at the University of California, Irvine. His research focuses on the Byzantine Empire and its legacy in the modern world. Betancourt's first book is an intellectual history of perception and the imagination from antiquity to the Middle Ages. His next book, Byzantine Intersectionality, Sexuality, Gender, and Race in the Middle Ages, will be out with Princeton University Press early next month. His presentation is titled Accidentally Byzantine, Training, Research, and Publishing as a Latinx Medievalist. Go ahead, Roland.
Thank you so much. And I really want to pick up the process of education and research that Nicole just sort of laid out from the undergraduate moment into the future that happens after that for students going into this. So throughout my youth, my parents insisted on reminding me that I was accidentally American, that I had been born in the United States rather than Cuba by a cruel accident of fate, that was their words. In my adulthood, I would find myself embroiled in another accidental identity, that of a Byzantinist, particularly a Byzantine art historian. Throughout graduate school, I would find myself slowly and quietly mouthing it to myself, Byzantinist, as I contemplated this odd identity I had come into. And across the entirety of my grad school, this otherness was reinforced by others who asked in shameless disbelief why a Latinx person was studying Byzantium, as they questioned the Latinidad of my name or of my appearance. I was one of maybe 3 Latinx people in the entire history of art program at Yale, who also happened to have no Latinx faculty and no one teaching in these areas during most of my time there. In other words, I had little mentoring regarding the realities of my training, research, and publishing as a Latinx person, and no real horizon, most importantly, for the potential directions my work could take in matters of inclusion, diversity, and representation. The only real mentorship I received on how to survive in academia came from the incredible group of Latinas and Black women with which I interned during 2 undergraduate summers at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And I will say as part of a multicultural internship program that no longer exists. There, I was fortunate to be surrounded by almost exclusively women of color who bore immense responsibility in the museum, but with little to no power or recognition. It was them who explained to me why a senior curator told me that I shouldn't talk with my hands. And it was they who showed me the contours of affect in white spaces, most importantly, that I had been previously foreign to me, having grown up in a predominantly Latinx space. The month before entering graduate school, I spoke with one of them about the troubles I had faced with my undergraduate advisors, how the relationship had soured, and how I had been treated. It was in that moment that she closed the door to her office and sat me down to give me the talk that my own mother could never have given me, about how academia had not been made for us. She recounted how, as a young Puerto Rican woman working on French literature, she had been repeatedly told to go study Spanish literature instead, as countless advisors questioned her intentions and explained to her that she actually didn't want this for herself, which is why she never went into a PhD program. This prepared me for grad school, so much so that the years of hearing the question, why Byzantine art, started to seem more comical. I began to start off conversations with the fact I was Cuban just to, get that out of the way. So all the shock, disbelief, confusion, and amusement of, but you don't look Cuban, could be put aside. Speaking once to a fellow art historian about our Cuban backgrounds, he refused to acknowledge the question and said to me, I thought we didn't talk about that here. It's taken me years to understand the realities of all this and the deep history of self-erasure that came with being a white passing art historian working on the Middle Ages, particularly Byzantium. A lot of the patrolling that came in my graduate training revolved around the forms of affect that were appropriate, and all too familiar stereotypes of being too dramatic or too emotional cropped up to my own perplexity as I strove to be as sincere and transparent as possible. Many of my skills were also undervalued, as Nicole has mentioned. For instance, the fact that Spanish was my native language was a triviality, given that it was neither French nor German, and therefore counted for nothing in my language qualifications or study. While advisors might butcher their way carelessly through a Spanish scholarly text, relying on their Italian or French, somehow my native fluency didn't allow me to do the same with these other, more augustly academic languages. The erasures were often not concrete. They were simple, systematic triples that accumulated into a disorienting feeling I could not describe until years later, and am still in the process of understanding. Often clouded and excused by the ever-moving target and quixotic dystopia of rigor. which denounces certain projects as anachronistic and certain methods as too personal. Most often, the complaints that I wasn't very well traveled came up, and the demand that I go abroad for several years of primary research, almost remedial research, was a major sticking point throughout my doctoral degree. As a queer Latinx person, I never felt as safe or comfortable to navigate in the conservative spaces of many monasteries across the Eastern Mediterranean that I should have gleefully taken up the opportunity to explore. It was seen as a failure on my part and explicitly attributed to laziness and haste. I put off one trip until last year, 10 years overdue, and it certainly turned out to be much that I feared it would be, a hostile space where I was physically harassed and repeatedly insulted. I was told I did not look like a professor, more likely because of my age. My religion was repeatedly questioned, though that was to be expected, and the monks were in disbelief that I could read the calligraphic Greek of their manuscripts, which they could not read. My fellow pilgrims were even more concerning, filled with a dazed, aggressive energy that I still cannot fully define beyond just modern homophobia and xenophobia. The kind monk who showed me the manuscripts urged me to get on the next boat and leave before nightfall. That idyllic space that my straight white male colleagues romanticized as transcendental did not exist for me. That harm could come to us from the sincerest undertaking of our research is something that was rarely acknowledged, but which my Black, trans, and cis female colleagues know very well. The emotional, physical, and sexual harassment that many of us face in archives and in remote research locations is something we have not yet fully come even close to reckoning with, and which requires a far longer conversation. I share these details precisely because they are mundane, because they are the filler and background noise that many medievalists of color live with, particularly our trans and queer colleagues. These all exist in addition to the more clearly defined roadblocks and gatekeeping, not to mention the wildly inaccessible places that fields like Byzantine studies or art history hold within our disciplines. As someone who has always pursued areas of study because of the questions that I wish to answer, not the aesthetics or personal attraction to the material, I truly did feel myself thrown into Byzantine art history, given its rich contemplations about the workings of images and its rich intellectual history in the Mediterranean. For years, I have raised alarm in my field about white supremacists' love of our little Byzantine empire, a fact that has almost been completely ignored by my colleagues in Byzantine studies or downplayed as meaningless. Byzantium is a fascination of bodies like QAnon and the far right, yet Byzantium has also been left out of conversations on the radicalized uses of medievalism. The reason for this is largely that for these groups, Byzantium, very disturbingly, does not appear as medieval, but rather as the new Rome of an ancient white ethno-state. Recently, as Byzantinists have lamented the politicized conversion of Hagia Sophia into a mosque, so have radical far-right groups that since around 2016 have been finding a new Islamophobic voice around the ideas of the reconquest of Constantinople and the destruction of the minarets of Hagia Sophia. In the March 2019 terrorist attack against 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, the shooters' manifesto explicitly stated, quote, "We are coming for Constantinople, and we will destroy every mosque and minaret in the city. The Hagia Sophia will be free of minarets, and Constantinople will be rightfully Christian-owned once more," end quote. And the deeper realities of these movements are far too toxic to mention here. As medieval studies begins to change, we need to be cognizant that the more room and efforts we make to support and promote medievalists of color and to tell narratives that challenge old racist, misogynistic, transphobic, and homophobic stereotypes, the more that these sinister sides of the field and public will unleash violence, rhetorical and physical, on the people of color in our institutions and disciplines. From threats to Zoom bombings, we need to always be prepared to support, promote, protect, and defend marginalized scholars and stories. But furthermore, we must understand that the demands of publishing today require us not to just be exceptional scholars, but also to be exceptionally cunning, so as to ensure that we are making the best attempts to produce unapologetic narratives of the past, striving to give voice to the incredible and astounding diversity of the Middle Ages. In publishing, our disciplines and institutions need to recognize that we, a new generation, are beginning to find our voice, and that voice is striving to be staunchly anti-racist. This means that how we write, how we argue, and how we imagine our audiences is changing. We cannot speak up to power by respecting the avenues and structures of power which created a medieval past in its own image. It is our sensibilities as people whose subjectivities have been molded by patterns of racism, transphobia, and homophobia that are precisely able to perceive in the past our predecessors. Yes, their identities are not explicitly defined like ours, but they also were not immune to millennia of systematic patterns that many of us have not only read in our primary medieval texts, but also heard lodged against us in grade school playgrounds. To think through the complexities of subject formation across history requires new, innovative methods. Those who are the first to explore these methods are often scholars of color, who are on the front lines combating racist pedagogies and narratives when others believe it impolite to do so. Therefore, in peer review and published reviews, it is scholars of color who are disproportionately attacked and slandered for daring to imagine a new tense of historical thought. From training to research to publishing, our disciplines and institutions need to acknowledge the work necessary to support scholars of color. We need to think carefully about the archives we callously send our grad students into and the harms they might face. We need to recognize the difficulties of our grad students face in professional, social spheres. We need to acknowledge who feels at home in our disciplines and ask why they feel at home. And we need to strive for compassion and construction in our review processes to understand a simple fact. You cannot demand that scholars of color show you the way and then complain that their scholarship and style does not look like the way you imagined it would look. Doing anti-racist work in our institutions and disciplines is not always about the amorphous system and its Byzantine systematics. Its greatest violences often come down to what box you tick on peer review forms or what compassion you show to struggling students. It is my hope that with these changes, I may find more scholars of color at home in my field, finding themselves accidentally Byzantine like me as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. Our next speaker is Terrell Campbell. Dr. Terrell R. Campbell is a native St. Louisan, all right? In addition to teaching courses on rhetoric and literatures, he works with several online and local organizations as a copywriter, editor, and content publisher. He received the Bachelor of Arts in History with a specialization in Middle Eastern literatures from Stanford University. Terrell was awarded a Master's of Art in Teaching from Webster University and Master of English and the Master of Historical Studies degree, respectively, from Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. In 2018, Dr. Campbell received the doctoral degree in English with particular focus on African American literatures and medieval studies from St. Louis University, I keep doing that. Beyond work, Taylor runs, bikes, and thoroughly enjoys a multitude of digital media platforms. He's married to his beautiful wife, Carousel, since 2007 and lives in the North St. Louis City area with their 3 cats, Smokey, Craig, and Aoife Grace.
Thank you for that introduction, Aphrodisia. I just wanted to talk today. My talk is entitled "Bad Men, Gangsters, and Camelot," and I really want to talk from the perspective of a student of color, a Black student who's navigated through the undergraduate process and the graduate process and actually survived, you know, pursuing some of the interests in medieval studies and kind of what has taken place since that quote unquote survival. Because I think as we try to create safe spaces for our BIPOC students to approach medieval studies and the Middle Ages within our respective institutions, and we're sometimes happy that they make that journey, we may lose track of what actually takes place to them once they leave us, because the battle continues. And so what I really want to kind of share are my struggles in attempting to weave my interest in scholarship in medieval studies into my professional and scholarly career, and how some of the institutions I've been a part of have exposed themselves with regards to their approaches to race, even while at the same time promoting and advocating more diversity amongst their teaching bodies. I began my career as a history teacher. I was a historian when I first got into these scholarly things. And I used to teach World History 1 and World History 2. Nicole, we were in the midst of changing it from World Civilization 1, Western Civ 1 and Western Civ 2 to World History 1 and World History 2 to reflect a more global Middle Ages, shall we say, right? But we know what generally happens in these restructuring of curricula. What really happened in my institution was we took Western civilization and tried to add some colored people to it, right? And so with my background in some medieval studies, I come across in World History 2, I come across the European Middle Ages, right? And it's almost impossible to escape the Arthurian tales, to escape Camelot, to escape Brutus, to escape all of that, and to escape Robin Hood. And so as I taught my students about some of the 14th century ballads of Robin Hood, and we began to learn how Robin Hood was celebrated as a social bandit or a bad man, I also knew that towards the end of the course, I have to get into the 20th century and in America, and I want to talk about the Black Panthers. You should have saw, you can't imagine the kind of consternation and alarm I caused within my very elite, very private college preparatory school when I suggested that there may be some similarities between Robin Hood and the Black Panthers. And it wasn't necessarily amongst my students. It was their parents when they would go home and be discussing what took place in class at the dinner table. And so my first exposure to how my interpretations and teachings of some medieval aspects might be received coming from this body was taught to me during my first teaching job fresh out of the university, because I think I graduated and started teaching, right? But I carried this concept of the bad man, of the social bandit, with me continuously, led to a paper called "The Classroom Was No Place for a Social Bandit," right? Because while the students may receive your tutelage well, particularly at the type of institution that I was teaching in, you have to be concerned about how the parents and the community may receive you, particularly when their names are on buildings on your school's campus, right? So as I left that institution because I wanted to teach on the university level where I would not have to be so responsible to parent desires, I went on to my master's program, and I had an interest in African American literature because that is where they pushed me by default. No one ever asked me really what I wanted to study as a graduate student. They just kind of looked at me and they said, you should be our African Americanist. But also carried interest of medieval studies with me as well. And I remember in the development of my master's thesis when I was working on Native Son, because I carried this knowledge with me of the social bandit and the bad man, I wanted to play with that, with the figure of bigger. I also wanted to play with it with respect to many approaches to the uses of transgressive languages that I had brought with me out of like the Corpus Christi plays, and say something like, and satire of the Third Estate, right? Where the transgressive is recognized as these border crossers and these people who flip the meanings of terms and knowledges on their heads, right? And play with them. And I wanted to play with bigger in a lumpen proletarian type of style as a border crosser, looking through these same types of lenses and structures. That was ixnayed. No one understood what the relevance between African American literature and any theoretical approaches that might come out of medieval studies. No one saw the confluence of those two. And while I'd grown somewhat used to this coming from some senior scholars who may happen to be white, I was kind of thrown aback when I got some of the same pushback from some scholars within the field of African American literatures who did not see any value of me bringing medieval studies into the thing. So I did what I did in my master's program and I moved on. During my doctoral studies, I'm glutton for punishment, I guess. I'm still wanting to play with this lumpen proletariat idea. And I'm wanting to play with the concept of the picaresque and Du Bois's submerged tenth, because so much attention is paid to Du Bois's talented tenth, right? Not much attention is paid to those gangsters and men of vice and those prostitutes and those bad people, those people that I descend from, those people that make migrations from places like Washington County, Mississippi, by all means necessary to survive, to produce people like myself. But I do know that my family has quite an attraction towards John F. Kennedy and his presidency. And I know that America is enamored with the Kennedys for their Camelot-esque atmosphere that they bring around themselves. And anyone who's done any studying into the Kennedy family knows good and well what was going on with Joe Kennedy and bootlegging and so on and so forth, and his connections to the gangsters of Chicago and the gangsters of New York. Yet and still, we still are capable of allowing a translatio imperii and a translatio studii when it comes into our interpretations of the Kennedy and this Camelot type of atmosphere that his presidency represented. And I only ask, why is this not a possibility? This plug and play and making of meaning and order, why is it not a possibility when it comes from Black bodies? When we find a story like John Henry that exists in a multiplicity of manners, why are we so quick to discount those that might plug into systems of meaning and order that do not seem reflective of Black bodies? That's a rhetorical question, because I'm not even allowed to theoretically investigate these things, let alone manifest them into reality. And so what the academy and what other institutions of learning that have their background and their foundational bedrock found within medieval approaches to education, because as Dorothy reminded me not too long ago, we must remember that this university is a medieval product. And all of our great college preparatory schools that prepare students for the university are also plugged into this way of thinking. What the academy and the institutions that I have taught in have shown me with regards to my body and my scholarly and professional interest is that I have to be a fugitive with regards to how I present them and demonstrate them to my students. I have to do it in a fashion almost when no one is paying attention. One of the most celebratory and stunning accomplishments of my career was the Belle de Costa Green Conference. And I tell you all, had my university known that that was something that I intended to do, they would have shut it down before it even had the opportunity to begin. It is only because my home department, the English department, as I was getting the conference together, they were shocked that I was a medieval scholar and I got the certificate from them. So had they known that I was attempting to plan, organize, and pull this thing off before it had gone too far, I'm not sure that it would have come off, because I'm not sure that anyone within the institution would have valued the intersections that I saw between disparate fields within the university and medieval studies. My advisor does not see the value in me with regards to my approach to medieval studies and African-American literatures. Perhaps refuses is a bad word. The end product has never written a letter in support of me for any teaching position that combines medieval studies and African-American literature. And Nicole SUNY Albany was desperately seeking someone to fulfill a position that could encompass African-American studies and medieval studies. And so these are the type of difficulties, even when we have great advisors like you all, even when we find great support networks like the Medievalist of Color, they only give us so much solace in certain terrains of this landscape that we journey through and traverse. Because still in many of our professional and scholarly pursuits, the very, very, very impediments that groups like Medievalists of Color and the Medieval Academy of America seek to help break down are there, and they are thriving, and they continue to manifest themselves in ways that say, hey, this is not for you. Thank you all for allowing me to share my experiences and my time. I hope they made sense.
Thank you, Terrell. Our next speaker is Dorothy Kim. Final speaker. Dorothy Kim teaches medieval literature at Brandeis University, and her presentation is titled White Supremacy and Medieval Studies. Go ahead, Dorothy.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen because I have slides. So hold on one second. Okay, hold on. Okay. I'll do that. All right, so thanks again for Medieval Academy for inviting me to do this. I think most of you will not be surprised that the title of my presentation today is White Supremacy and Medieval Studies. So in June 2020, as many of our conferences went online, the Society for the History of the Early American Republic, SHEAR, erupted in controversy as a plenary panel for the annual conference was live streamed on Facebook. Scholars Don Peterson and Laurel Clark Shire described the white supremacist incident in their post entitled, quote, A Man of His Time and the Methods of White Supremacy, SHEAR 2020 and the Plenary Debacle, unquote. As they explained, what happened to the plenary speaker, Daniel Feller, historian at the University of Tennessee, the editor of Andrew Jackson's papers, quote, the plenary based on a pre-circulated essay was a debacle. By giving an apologist for slavery and Indian removal a large platform, SHEAR highlighted ongoing weaknesses both within the society and in the historical profession writ large regarding the histories of African American and Indigenous people and of race and white supremacy more broadly. Feller's defensiveness was evident from the start. During the session, he excoriated journalists and historians for misrepresenting Jackson as a hardcore racist and the originator of Indian genocide. He dismissed scholarly interrogations of Jackson's policies as being part of a politically motivated campaign to decry Donald Trump, who claims Jackson as a personal hero and inspiration. The essay demonstrated a stubborn refusal to engage scholarship by Indigenous and African American historians, or even by other scholars of their histories. Instead, he misrepresented and caricatured recent work on Jackson, most of it by women historians, as he excused and defended Andrew Jackson's policies. During the Q&A session, he refused to address Jackson's slaveholding, lack of time, he said. And at the end of the plenary, he even spoke aloud and then repeated a racist slur. The speaker's essay and its delivery, combined with a senior all-white panel of respondents, indicated that SHEAR had failed to ensure that this panel would represent its own policies on diversity, equity, and inclusion, unquote. I bring this episode up today for several reasons. Oops, sorry. This kind of public-facing live demonstration of the continued white supremacist core of various fields is happening now at so many institutions, fields, and scholarly organizations who have, all of them, have written statements in support of Black Lives Matter after the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota during June 2020. Yet these public-facing white supremacist demonstrations continue to happen at the conference and meeting events of our institution fields and scholarly societies, as they have all now moved publicly online. For medieval studies, we have already been ahead of the public white supremacist curve since 2017, when several medievalists of color critiqued the Leeds International Medieval Congress for their theme, otherness, for precisely this kind of white supremacist debacle. As the Chronicle of Higher Education reports, quote, Vincent van Garen-Oy arrived on time for the 9 a.m. keynote lecture at the annual International Medieval Congress at the University of Leeds in England, titled, quote, The Mediterranean Other and the Other Mediterranean, Perspectives of Alterity in the Middle Ages, unquote. The lecture kicked off one of the largest annual medieval conferences in the world, which this month featured the theme of otherness. He took a seat near the front row, but as soon as the introductions began, he noticed something odd. All of the speakers discussing otherness were white European men. Well, that's awkward, he recalls thinking. I wonder whether anyone's going to say something about this. But in introducing the keynote speech, the moderator made a joke about otherness. If audience members thought he was just another old white man, they should just wait until after his holiday at the beach, unquote. This was in the summer of 2017. Thus began a series of ongoing white supremacist methods, gatekeeping, and debacles from what happened to the International Society of what was then named Anglo-Saxon Studies Conference in Hawaii in the summer of 2017, and the lockout of Ademir Shira's work to the conference, even as he is one of the few, if not the only, indigenous Hawaiian medievalist in the field of medieval studies, and absolutely the only one in Old English studies, to eventually what we saw in Charlottesville, with the Unite the Right riot and the murderous violence of Matthew Heimbach and Jason Kessler's various white supremacist groups as these white supremacists murdered Heather Heyer and made clear the upholding of white heritage politics links to the visual and embodied symbols of the classic and medieval past. So medieval studies has spent a number of years openly dealing with the debacle of white supremacy, yet the situation of our field outstrips most of what we are seeing in other areas of academia because we have a known and documented and prevalent fascist white supremacist academic problem in our midst. It is very telling when, as far as I can tell, in the last 20 years, there have been as many known and identified white supremacist fascists who have won MAA awards as there have been BIPOC scholars who have won MAA awards. We have a deep, abiding, continuous white supremacy and fascist problem in our field, and it's not from outside agents of the public. It's within the field, and it's caught enough attention that in every major including the New York Times, including the New York Times, describes what is happening, often interviewing many medievalists. So our white supremacist fascist problem is pretty clear to the rest of academia, if not the general public. So I opened with a Shear 22 example because what blew up publicly for the early Americanists is actually a regular occurrence in our field at our conferences. Just this week at a European symposium, a senior medieval archaeologist apparently said the following about scholars, especially Mary Rumbar and Ulm and other MOCs, who were pointing to the racist histories of the term Anglo-Saxon. Quote, this is intellectual warfare by totalitarian iconoclasts and a political rally of Pyongyang, unquote. Apparently, he also appears to have attacked the use of critical race theory in medieval studies. I bring this up because this can be mapped onto the comments of Trump this week, let alone in the last several months. First, the idea that those asking for anti-racism are the totalitarian problem, the continued racial anti-Asian slurs in relationship to Kim Jong-un, though a variation I have seen regularly in relationship to me is also in relationship to Mao. That critical race theory is destroying the study and education of the historical past. Then that was just this week. These are all points that uphold white heritage rhetoric, white heritage and white identity politics. Both Trump and this senior white medievalist rhetoric are examples that would fit into Carol Anderson's book, White Rage. But this is just a regular weekly white rage that occurs in medieval studies as a field directed towards MOC scholars who point to the continued white supremacy and racism problem of our field, and who also are demanding anti-racism of the field. However, medieval studies goes much further than most other fields' current racial reckonings. As so many of you know, we have a white supremacist fascist violence problem in our academic spaces. So in the grand pyramid of white supremacy, we as a field are close to the top. We are in the calls to violence level, tipping into the violence level of the white supremacist pyramid. Really, the only level from there is basically genocide. Everything below that level happens regularly in medieval studies at every white supremacist pyramid. So we are at the level that includes neo-Nazis, the KKK, the N-word, Confederate flags, or Crusader flags, or white national supremacist flags, etc. Everything below that level happens regularly in medieval studies at every conference, scholarly meeting, interactions, to MOCs. We have medieval fascist white supremacists who have incited violence against MOC publicly in our field. If you locate the early Americanists and their Sheer 2020 conference, they are situated at the discrimination level of that pyramid. So yes, what I am saying is that medieval studies is still the worst, and other fields know it. If our institutions, organizations, and conferences are engines by which white supremacy is embedded into our field, then we have to understand one thing about how organizations work. Victor Ray explains in his article, A Theory of Racialized Organizations in the American Sociological Review, that, quote, race is constitutive of organizational foundations, hierarchies, and processes. With this argument, he lays out a 4-point schema. 1, racialized organizations enhance or diminish the agency of racialized groups. 2, racialized organizations legitimate the unequal distribution of resources. 3, whiteness is a credential. And 4, decoupling is racialized. Each of these tenets highlights the connection of racial schemas to a particular set of material and social resources. Seeing organizations as racial structures provide a descriptive, more realistic picture of organizational formation, hierarchies, and processes, unquote. I want to foreground his work in discussing what I see in medieval studies organizations. Our major conferences, and I would say, other than the Medievalists of Color, every medieval studies organization, scholarly org, has always actually default imagined itself as a white racial organization. Our major conferences and scholarly orgs have written out and published Black Lives Matter and anti-racism statements, yet continue to platform white supremacist fascists at their conferences by allowing them to speak on panels at these venues. Yes, Kalamazoo 2020, we all saw what was on your program. Leeds is not any better, as they continue to never take the safety and security of their MOC participants seriously or address this major problem. I can name other major scholarly medieval studies orgs and their conferences that have also done the same thing. This reveals Victor Ray's tenets 1 to 3 working. Our major conferences and scholarly orgs publish Black Lives Matter and anti-racism statements, but allow panels that discuss how both the anti-racist and fascist supporters at Charlottesville are equally as violent and are at fault for Charlottesville, and for the discussion about white supremacy and racism in medieval studies. This, of course, mimics Trump's exact statement after Charlottesville. And finally, and my thanks to Eric Wade for pointing this out, our large conferences and scholarly orgs publish Black Lives Matter and anti-racism statements, yet they publish on the same page of their conference website a discussion that directs conference attendees to call the campus police in relationship to campus safety. I pulled from the pyramid of white supremacy because this is really where the field and our institutions, scholarly orgs, and conferences are at. We have not been able to dismantle these issues of racialized violence, calls to violence, discrimination, veiled racism, minimization, indifference. I will show you now, to wrap up, an anti-racism visualization based on Ibrahim Kendi's work. Though I agree with the critique of his work that there is no such thing as reverse racism, and thus the work itself also has some issues, nonetheless, the anti-racism visualization is useful because it shows where medieval studies as a field, its institutions, and scholarly orgs cannot even get to. We are not anywhere on this chart. Medieval studies is synonymous with white supremacy because we are firmly upholding white supremacy. We are not an anti-racist space, field, discipline. Our institutions, scholarly orgs, and conferences continue to operationalize white supremacy. Our racial white supremacist reckoning is going to require that we dismantle the white supremacist pyramid before we can even begin the anti-racist visualization. Thank you. Oops.
Thank you, Dorothy. All right, before the Q&A, I just wanted to ask the panelists if they wanted to comment on or have questions of the other panelists before I open it up to the questions that we've received during the talk.
There's a lot of stuff.
There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff.
There's a lot of stuff, and I think, especially in thinking about students and going through the experience of encountering, or working or trying to work in this field, there's also a lot, there are moments where we've all discussed like the ways in which various members of the field, whether it be instructors or advisors or just, people that we are at conferences, really go out of their way to make sure to make medievalists of color know that they are not welcome, right? And it's not just a passive thing. We are not necessarily discussing it as explicitly or maybe a little explicitly, but it's also like sabotagey, right? It's like full on aggressive sabotage, right? And I mean, I pointed to Carol Anderson's White Rage, but really that seems to be the ongoing like affect rolling in a lot of our on medieval studies spaces when we enter it and just say anything, right? And especially if we say something like, maybe we don't want to be the fascist and white supremacist field, and maybe it's good for us to try to be anti-racist, or maybe we should discuss the fact that this field has been built on a kind of foundation of racist white supremacy. There's a lot of affective white rage about that manifests.
Else want to chime in?
Just to be fair to some people who might see this, you know, and it also plays in the other way, Dorothy, and what I mean by that is they both have an absolute value of making medievalists of color feel unwelcome. At least from my perspective, you know, I know some of the people from African-American literary corners who were kind of frowning upon things. I know they were coming from a good place, right? Because they're aware of the struggles that take place within medieval studies. But my point to them was that's exactly why the presence is needed within the field. And so trying to get even those who are concerned and supposedly in support of our students sometimes to recognize that their very advice is also doing a disservice in their attempt to try to protect the students. You know, their advice might be doing a disservice to the very students they're wishing to help. Because really in the grand scheme of things, some of the people who were supposed to be in my corner, their efforts have been just as injurious as those who do not wish to see me in the field, you know.
Thanks. Everyone else, feel free to chime in. I'm going to begin with the questions that we've received, and you know, anyone can answer these, although some of them are directed at particular panelists. There's actually been a lot of questions which sort of dovetail with pedagogy. So what we teach, how we're taught, right? Let me begin with the first question. As a scholar of color who has been very successful with research and grants, I've suffered greatly from the jealousy of senior white colleagues. That has all but destroyed my research work and career. What can we do to mitigate against the jealousy of white colleagues who have deep-seated personal issues related to the success of non-white scholars? This is an issue that is being discussed widely now as scholars look into the question of what fuels white supremacy. One of the answers that has emerged is jealousy of the success of the other. Thanks for considering this question. I hope the answer will help junior scholars of color. So the question there is, what can we do to mitigate against the jealousy of white colleagues who have deep-seated personal issues related to the success of non-white scholars? Anyone want to answer that?
I can start. I think how whiteness works, how white supremacy works within academia has been heavily written about, right? And so I think the thing, at least for me, reading about critical whiteness studies has helped understand the levers, the sort of maneuvers, the sort of various like ways in which white supremacy happens in academic spaces. And so this is like under the umbrella of whiteness as property. Whiteness as Property is an 80-some page classic of critical whiteness studies, critical race studies that Cheryl L. Harris published. It's a legal article, and it sort of lays out a whole range of discussions about whiteness as property and how whiteness wants to own things, right? Including the whiteness wants to own various fields, which then like folds into gatekeeping. Whiteness also wants to say, oh yes, I can just move in and take over this area of, say, critical race studies because I feel like it, because I own it, even though I've done none of the work. I'm always fascinated by that because I cannot imagine you know, someone who's never done any work in manuscript studies all of a sudden deciding that they're the expert and can somehow make a commentary on someone's work on, you know, medieval 12th to 15th century bookbinding just because, right? So like what exactly gets owned even though there's actually no work done in those areas? And I think it's then similar, it becomes a sort of frame out. So whiteness as property is a very useful you know, classic critical whiteness studies work that actually explains so many things that we encounter or see happening and the kind of tensions and sabotage and all that other stuff.
Anybody else want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, I'll just follow up with that along the same lines. As Dorothy said, the research is there. And that's also what I tell my colleagues, because I've definitely faced this as well. You know, I'm like, look it up. It's literally right there. And, you know, what happens, this has happened to me as well, that people will then say, oh, yeah, you know, well, you got your tenure track job because you're a woman and Latina. And it's like, you want to look at the stats on that? That's it's just, it doesn't hold up at all. And I mean, you know, as Dorothy said, that unfortunately often because of this whiteness as property, that response doesn't, you know, really sink in. But there's a lot of writing on this. The stats are there, the research is there, and just knowing that, I mean, unfortunately, it doesn't just transform the system that we know this, but, you know, you can just kind of keep hammering back that the research is out on this. It's not, you know, really open to debate. You know, we have the stats over hiring. We have, you know, 40 years of critical race theory. So, you know, it is a field. You can just keep referring back to it. And I think just doing that and doing that publicly helps junior colleagues, helps students. I've had to do it with senior colleagues in front of students, you know, when they've said things like that. Just been like, well, you know, look it up. We're researchers. And I think that just that in and of itself, saying, no, it's all right there, is something that is helpful, even though it doesn't change, unfortunately, their response specifically.
To add to that, particularly this idea that somehow like you got your job because you were like a medievalist of color is like so utterly not based on any kind of evidence-based foundation, because we know it's the other way. I mean, when you have like the Harvard Business Review discussing how hiring happens, that in fact to even be hired as a woman of color, you have to have at least another woman of color be like a finalist, that like if there's one woman or if there's one person of color, the odds of them hiring you are out. And then, you know, you can see this like consistently. There was a really great thread, I think yesterday or the day before on Twitter, by a computer scientist who had just read Tressie McCotton's, Tressie McMillan McCotton's Thick, and had realized that what she writes about in Thick in relationship to understanding a certain idea of what it means to move in the world as a Black woman in America in relationship to race and like HR, basically. He applied that to computer science. He's an Asian American man, right? So he's basically looking at that and he's pointing out in this really amazing thread that, you know, 36% of Asian American, there are 36% of students in computer science programs that are Asian American. And yet in like 22 programs are, you know, in the country of a certain caliber, there are only 2 faculty who are Asian American. So this idea, like we say we need to like bring in the students, but also this is not a pipeline issue either, right? So this idea that somehow you are going to hire the medievalists of color and that is some sort of boon is actually a racist dog whistle, right? And it like actually it sort of folds into this whole kind of mythology. And it was used at Charlottesville of they will not replace us, right? This idea that we're somehow replacing them when that is so not the case, right? We can literally look at the stats of the jobs that were advertised in the last couple of years. Several of them wanted like people who did race or global Middle Ages and like all these things, but then they hired white men or white people. So like, we can talk about that, but like this like weird affective idea. And then with that, the even statistics of how many medievalists of color there are, like we make less than 1% of the medieval studies population at a rough estimate. There are barely about 100 of us like worldwide that identify. And yet there are like over 200 people in this one digital medieval like study Stormfront group where they get to hang out with a bunch of like white supremacists and fascists happily, stalking a bunch of us. There are over 200 of them, but like somehow we have like overwhelmed like the fields in some way when there are just like so few of us.
It's just, every time you speak about it, it just makes me depressed. But I just would like to speak to the question from the perspective of someone who did not handle it very well as I began my career, and hopefully have began to handle it a little better. For a long time, I was always the youngest person wherever I worked, which combined with the racial thing sometimes rubbed people the wrong way. And considering my first job was at my alma mater, I really didn't know how to handle it, because some of the feelings that I was receiving came from people who I looked up to and who had literally taught me. And it took me a while, because I thought I was going crazy at first, but it took me a while to recognize, now this is not necessarily for awards or grants or anything like that, but at private schools, it's about the student's attention. Because if we've ever taught at a private elitist college preparatory school, you know that the number one bartering chip is how the community feels about you, right? And so it took me, I thought I was going crazy because the students, they just gravitated towards me because I was closer to them in age. But some of my older colleagues, first they began to rear their head with just petty jealousies, and then it moved into the sabotage area. And it moved so far to where my academic acumen began to be questioned. And to be quite truthful, it's one of the reasons why I left the institution, just because I did not want to deal with it anymore. As I've gotten older, I've learned to just confront it and call it out when I see it. Most recently, with respect to my research committee, you know, I had a senior scholar who had agreed to be on board with some things. And when the grants and the awards came down, they voiced an opinion that I had included them without their permission and that they knew nothing about the endeavor that was taking place, which really placed my funding in jeopardy and really placed my professional ethos on the campus in jeopardy with regards to how I interacted with my other colleagues. And I had to push that matter all the way up to the powers that be to get that cleared up, because I did not want any of my colleagues to think that I would walk around on campus placing their names on research projects without their permissions. And so as I've gotten older, I've just become more diligent and more vigilant in protecting my ethos and my reputation and my scholarly pursuits. And it's not something that was, it was something that was learned with a lot of scars and the breaking of some friendships. So I do not envy the person who submitted that question. I do not have a ready answer for them. What I will suggest to them is the more they look inside themselves, the more they will know what they will be willing to stand for and what they will not be willing to stand for. And perhaps that will motivate them to the correct, if there is, actions for them.
Just to add one more thing to that, I mean, just like listening to this is that I think people have to understand that you know, mentors, medievalists may be supportive at various stages, but like there's a power dynamic. If you are, you know, if you are a faculty member and you're supporting students, there is an unbalanced power dynamic. And once you get a PhD and then they're supposed to treat you like a colleague, then it's a whole other power dynamic. And I think this is the bit where things, you know, then they have to treat you with equity and equitably, right, as a colleague and not as a student. And that's when things start to often, from what I have heard from other people, really go haywire.
Yeah, I think there's several questions I think that you have all sort of spoken to, but we've got a bevy of them. So let me get to the others. All right. The source question. Is there a good source on the process, timing, and ideological goals underlying the creation of the concept of Western civilization? More narrowly, is there any way to trace the justifications for colonialism back to the Crusader states in the Eastern Mediterranean and the dismissal of the West of the Byzantine Empire as well, Byzantine?
Since the word Byzantine is in there, I will begin answering this question. I think that there are a lot of useful sources. If you look at the work of Judith Herron or Peter Brown, they really acknowledge the transitions and formations that form the uniqueness of the Middle Ages. These are sort of classic texts that are important to read, not in just in what they have to tell us, but also in what they share to us about how we perceive the Middle Ages historiographically. I personally like recommending, for anyone entering the Byzantine Empire, Averell Cameron's very short Byzantine Matters, which is a great sort of snapshot of this is what the field looks like. This is the challenges of being a Byzantine historian, a Byzantine art historian. It's a very good rundown of the realities of where the Byzantine Empire stands. The one thing that's also very important to stress is that while there are these ideas of a Western civilization that float around and that unite amorphously, something that's very present for me as an art historian is that the formation of these conversations and their implications for research across various fields are very much formatted according to the history of those fields. So for example, if someone wanted to ask that question to me as an art historian, I would say you need to look at the work of, yes, Vasari, but also people like Winkelmann, who are collecting a sort of aesthetically driven ideation of the West and creating from those fragments this notion of the West. And Byzantium is a great example because it demonstrates to you this odd position that it's had throughout its history. You know, it's Edward Gibbon's, those effeminate Greeks of Byzantium, not very much within that Western canon, very much marginalized. I would recommend, for example, Robert Nelson's The Map of Art History. It's a great survey of just opening art history survey books and looking physically at where Byzantium stands and sort of its parallel treatment to like the one chapter on Islamic art that covers everything from the inception of Islam to the present, similar for Byzantium. And so those are some recommendations. I think this is a conversation that you can approach in various ways. If you're looking at post-colonial theory, if you're looking at the formation of a particular discipline, it's actually quite complex. And so that's an important aspect because that complexity shows us that despite all the nuance, there is still a sort of, I want to call it like bad common sense, this idea that you're just using common sense to stitch out this Western idea. Which I think requires a lot of pushback and a lot of historiographic work to understand.
You're still muted.
There you go. Thank you for your response. I'm going to ask another more pedagogical question that is directed towards three of us. Okay, it's a question for Drs. Campbell and perhaps also McKinnon and Lopez-Janssen. I also teach World Civ and organized my first Kalamazoo panel on the teaching of the global Middle Ages about 15 years ago. That panel was eye-opening in many ways, especially in that much of the discussion focused on whether medieval was a time or a sensibility slash set of similar circumstances. This has not really changed as far as I can tell. So my question is, could we, or how could we, teach a global Middle Ages that only minimally refers to Europe? Anyone?
Okay. For me, that is actually a question that I'm still wrestling with as a younger scholar into this, being permitted into this. And what I mean by that is I've spent so much time of my career trying to flesh out Western Civ, right? Because that was what I was pretty much allowed to do. Like this approach to the Middle Ages as something outside of Europe is relatively new. The allowance to look at it at such a perspective is something relatively new for me, right? The pedagogical structures that I've been in just did not allow it, right? So for me, I always, my approach to it was always really, what is going on in other areas of the world at this time that is designated as the European Middle Ages? So really structurally, with regards to how I approach it, I don't really have a better tent pole to begin my inquiry in people outside of Europe other than that time period, because it is the concerted focus on European and whiteness during that time period that has led me to want to find other stuff going on during that time period. So I hope that makes some sense.
I'll jump in, and part of this is just from I'm coming from this from a totally different place, only because in 2012, I got hired as an adjunct at John Jay to teach Global Middle Ages, the first time I ever taught it, with less than a week to prep. And so the chair of the department, who was actually a Chinese historian, gave me her syllabus and was like, this is what I do. Use as much as you want. And I really had maybe 3 days before the course was starting. I didn't even have access to all of the university, like Blackboard or anything, when the course started, because it was so like last minute. So I ended up actually using a lot of her stuff. And yeah, I mean, I also approach it as the time period, but in terms of world history, sometimes they go away from calling it medieval, like that is a European term, but they'll call it third wave civilizations. But there is this connectivity throughout Afro-Eurasia that is going on. And you do have, it is this post-imperial time and then imperial again in China as well. And so just randomly having to have learned a ton of stuff about Tang and Song Dynasty China at the time, it is absolutely possible to even not really talk about Europe. And so when I've looked at that time period in general for ancient and world civs to 1500, I actually don't talk about Europe that much, because honestly, in terms of Afro-Eurasian connectivity, it's not that important in that general time period of like 500 to 1500. You do bring it in, but it really is about your positionality. I think the thing is that we as medieval European historians, this is what we know, and so a lot of us branch out from there. But if you are actually looking at this Afro-Eurasian interconnectedness, Europe is really not that important during most of that time period. There's so much going on with the Islamic world. There's so much going on with Africa. There's so much going on with China and India and everything, that it is actually quite easy to spend very little time, if you're talking about a time period and connectedness, not focusing on Europe. But you do have to kind of step back and think about, well, what's going on in this period of time, and how am I going to design my course in a way that's uncomfortable for a lot of us, because what we know, what we learned about our entire careers, where it was Europe.
Yeah.
So
I was going to. Where am I on?
do you want? Oh,
I want to really chime in really quickly about your sort of strategy for teaching that course, because not an historian but an arts faculty member, and I had the same experience, which is it's actually really easy to teach a course that minimally emphasizes Europe at this time period, because you just have to tell one of the truths of the time period, which is the cultural and technological powerhouses were other peoples, and Europe was kind of, you know, was kind of marginalized on the side in the receiving end, and students, particularly American students, not that well versed in history, and so they're like, okay, that is the, you know, this is the new sort of historical truth that I'm being taught, a sort of, you know, artistic truth as well.
You know, depending on where we are though, Aphrodisia, it's not the students that's the problem, right? It's their tuition paying parents that become the problem, right? Because
yeah.
Because I have to figure out a way to basically sneak that into the curriculum, right?
It does depend on where you're teaching, because there are places where now at NYU in liberal studies, we switch from an all Western curriculum to a global curriculum. There are places that don't want to do that. So,
And
you know, it's an institutional problem. Dorothy, you want to say something now?
So I'm actually one of the co-PIs now, so I will just link this. There is the site. You can go to the GMAP site and look at things. But I think maybe more interesting is, you know, what is going, like this question is kind of interesting in a panel that's about institutions and race and racism. And I kind of want to know, well, like, what's going on with this urge to talk about the global Middle Ages? Is it because of a kind of thinking through the canons of our field and the kind of constructions of Western civilization and the constructions like in art history, but also in history and also in English literature, in the literatures, right? This kind of canon of like Western foundational things. And so I'm kind of curious to, I don't know, open that up.
Anybody else want to chime in on that question? All right. If not, let me.
Well, I just wanted to say that I was having I think high school education is so important in everything we do, because that's really the space, you know, I would not have become an art historian if it weren't for the fact that I went to a very large public school, almost 5,000 students, and we had a lot of AP classes, which allowed me to take AP art history and things like that. It was these sort of like amazing opportunities that we had. They also paid for the AP exam. So like, it was really accessible, and high school is so important in all this. And I was speaking with someone recently who's a high school teacher, and they go, but how can I teach Byzantium in like, you know, in a different way? Like you know, the Dark Ages, like how do I get away from that narrative? And I'm like, they don't know anything. Just don't teach them the narrative. Don't emphasize the bubonic plague and Justinian, like talk about everything else. Like you can say so much about Byzantium because they have no prejudices against the Middle Ages. And even if and a colleague of mine, Brian Keene, has recently also mentioned the fact that, you know, we don't have to make the Middle Ages relevant. They are already relevant to so many of our students through popular culture, that it is also a way that we can stress whatever Middle Ages we want to, and go into pockets that they're gonna find a lot more interesting, because, you know, I can talk about automata in the Byzantine and Islamic world, but I cannot do that in the West except literary tropes. So those are really the ways that I think we can also expand. Like, they don't know anything, like teach them what's out there.
All right, thank you. All right, I think I'm going to try to combine two questions that are sort of similar themes. It has been said that many medievalists of color have left academia in order to pursue other opportunities separate from the difficulties associated with being a BIPOC scholar and pushing against systemic racism in academia. As grad students of color complete their programs, do you see job prospects improving for them? What about the scholars who work, who work now outside of academia, do you see hope for them getting positions as racism in institutions is addressed while competing for those same positions as newly graduated graduate students? And then another question is, I can locate it here, is how can we encourage and support BIPOC students who want to study medieval studies, i.e. not reinforce the idea that medieval studies is not for them, while also being honest with them about the problems in the field and protect them in professional spaces that are harmful to them? So we've got, so I can summarize that. Are things going to get better? What do we do about this contingency of scholars of color who are trying to get back in? And for those who are trying to get in for the first time, what can we do to protect them?
This is like a huge question, but also like I mean, it's not, it's, you know, we're at a kind of academic reckoning, right, Plummet? There's one medieval European history job in North America. There's one medieval English literature job in North America. I don't know how it is in art history. How's it going in art history?
It's very similar, and I can say some stuff about that as well.
Yeah, so that's it, right? So, you know, the market has tanked completely, and it's not as if people haven't said the market is tanking or has tanked, you know, ever since like 2000, like the late 2008 or 9, right? So it's not as if there's ever been like, I think maybe the question is there. I mean, I think we're going to have a big set of questions. We are seeing programs making decisions in art history and history across the board in arts and sciences not to open up admissions for graduate school for next year as the ethical choice, right? We're seeing other programs saying we're going to focus on admissions only in Black studies, right? Or in work related to Black studies. So I don't know where this is going to go. And I think this is like a difficult thing, right? I think there is a way in which we all have to deal with the fact that there are no jobs in this particular profession, writ large, right? And what that means and what the ethical issues are in then encouraging people to pursue degrees in academia writ large if the expectation is that they're going to get some sort of tenure track professorial thing, or like I think this is like, in the end, it is up to the students to make these decisions, but they should have all the information possible, but also like at least be able, we have not done a good job thinking about other things. But I think there's also this question of like, why get this degree if you want to do something else as well? And to like actually respect that. So I think there's like a lot of questions up in the air about this, right? And also kind of reckonings like financial and otherwise, right? You know, we are like, if we are already a kind of, there are a couple things going on. We're already a kind of imagined as a white supremacist, like very 1% sort of field, right? What does that mean, and who gets to actually do the work to get these kind of degrees to then be that professorial body to teach this kind of stuff, right? Will that only mean that students who have access to a certain kind of wealth and resources will be able to do that? Because, you know, it's really kind of impossible otherwise. What does it mean then also that if we are kind of seen as a white supremacist field and various, I mean, I'm dubious about how well racial reckonings are going to happen across academia, but, you know, like if there is a kind of like, well, why should we want to hire a medievalist, right? How does that fit into the equation in our departments about racial reckonings and anti-racism? So, I mean, I think there's a lot, but I think there's also, you know, I think it's a very fraught set of issues and questions.
If I could add a little bit to that, I mean, I think one of the things that I've been noticing in trends in jobs in art history and history is that in the few jobs, there's a lot of effort to diversify the areas that have been represented in art history, for example. So putting out jobs that are really focusing like African-American topics, thinking about like the diaspora and so forth. But one of the things that I would also like to see is having more of these jobs aimed at critical race studies, gender and sexuality that are open area, because sadly that's one of the things that happens. Like for example, institutionally, this is one of my biggest challenges in the University of California. Our general education requirement in multicultural studies needs to be focused on the United States and its realities of racial discrimination and so forth. Which means that when I proposed a class on the Middle Ages, I couldn't get that approved as a multicultural class and a requirement that would draw students to learn more about the diversity of the Middle Ages. So what I had to come up with is this method that is very true to what I do. It's called image collision, where I begin with one work of medieval art and one work of contemporary art to think about the connections and discussions we can have about issues of racism, gender, and sexuality across time periods. But it's true that, and I think this is really at fault of a lot of our colleagues, as well-meaning as they can be, that also are denying the applicability of issues of gender, sexuality, and race for the Middle Ages, because it lessens the validity of having a job out there that says medieval studies, like wanting to diversify medieval studies by creating jobs. The most that I've seen is sort of like medieval studies and then a passing line of like, it'd be great if you sort of knew something of, and then here's a litany of things where race might be one of them, but it's also like the global Middle Ages and the Silk Route and like all these other things that sort of water down the focus of a job. And so I would like to see more of these like open area jobs that target aspects of study. And it also reflects more of the changes in scholarship that we've had, where really you want a formation in critical race studies if you're dealing with these issues. You want a formation in gender and sexuality beyond a period specific to ask these questions responsibly for the present. So I think that's also something that we really need to, in how we present jobs, the few that are out there that create more room and latitude for medievalists and those in the pre-modern world more broadly.
I pretty much have given up on being a professor of medieval studies of any type in the academy. I just have had more success outside of the academy. Whole reason why I'm here with you all has nothing to do with anything that the academy has supported me in doing. I don't even know how gung-ho I am with regards to African American studies and African American lit pursuing the tenure track. It just was such a distasteful process for me. And I come with baggage. You do enough Google searching, you'll know the baggage that I come with. And so it's this changing landscape, particularly in the midst of this COVID environment. I've really just been trying to look at it as an opportunity. Somebody said we don't have to teach the Middle Ages with the bubonic plague anymore, right? But from my perspective, coming out of scholarship in Mideastern cultures and literatures, the bubonic plague shut down Islamic control of many ports and opened up Europe to be able to control them. So I'm kind of looking at this pandemic environment as possibly an opportunity to reimagine the applicability of the scholarship and professionalism that I've been lucky enough to receive. Because the tenure track thing, I can't afford it, right? I gotta eat. and I've been a student for so long to the outlook of the tenure process is, I don't think my wife will sit through it, right? It's just, and so as I was telling Dorothy, I'm trying to grow as content as I can in this administrative position that I've been lucky enough to have. And if that can provide some type of security, then it will allow me to follow my scholarly desires with a little bit more heft and a little bit more passion than what the academy offered. But don't get me wrong, had the tenure stuff and the other processes worked out well, I would have continued with them. But the prospects they just weren't exactly there for me. And so I think, as Dorothy said, there needs to be a real, like, mature conversation, sophisticated, nuanced, however you want to describe it, but the students really need to reflect on what it is that they're after and what they're willing to put up with in pursuit of their goals. And that's, I mean, that's life, right? So that's what I will add.
I just want to add, Terrell, that when you put together that DaCosta Green conference, I mean, for me, that was like a great expression of, like, if you want to do it, do it. You might have to do it, like under the table. You may have to do it in a different department than you thought. You may have to do it outside the academy. But people do this because they're passionate,
Right.
and maybe they get fed some other way.
Oh, yes, I can. I apologize. When I say the academy, I am talking about this university thing, this scholarship, this professoriate thing. I am not talking about the MAA. I apologize. I will be sure. You see what the university has done to me? It's the only academy that exists, right? So yes, when I say the academy, I'm referring to this amorphous, nebulous network that we all engage in that primarily plays gatekeeper on our ambitions to do what we want to do. The Medieval Academy of America has been great for me. It has opened up doors I never thought I would be able to knock on. So I am greatly indebted to the MAA for all of its help and support.
Maybe, I mean, just to add to that though, I worry about this idea of, like, almost like this idea that the only people who can then really be quote unquote medievalists are people who get unpaid, and it's about their love, right? So there's this whole kind of labor issue at play here, right? And then we're sort of back to the 19th century and who got to be like these scholars, right? Who were basically doing it off of the largesse of their like individual or family fortunes, right? Who could go on these trips and go and do this kind of research and have the kind of leisure to, like, write quote unquote scholarship. So I think there's like a whole cluster of issues at play here, right? So, and I mean, we're kind of looking at a kind of, cratering disaster. So I don't really know how to really discuss it other than what it is.
It is, and, it's, you make me feel so depressed about it, right? Because it's like, I'm just fighting to try to keep my passion alive, right? Like, wherever I can get some fertilization and some water poured on my desire to do the thing, that's where I'm giving my energy to, and it would be great if our institutions that we were a part of always felt the same about our goals as we do. But as we've all known, even in the best situations, that's sometimes not the case. And so I hear you, Dorothy, but I'm just like, well, what do you do? I just stop, right? And, the rest of my life, I get to teach rhetoric. I mean, rhetoric's cool, right? But it doesn't float my boat. And so the only way that I can do it is to try to make some space for myself somewhere.
So it's about that fugitivity you talked about earlier.
Yeah. And it's not the best feeling in the world to go through all the years of training that we do only to have to fight to use it, right? But, I'm literally having to be transgressive to be in accord with everybody else. And it is what it is, right? No, it's a famous quote of our leader, right? I mean, but I don't know, you keep kicking to hopefully one day you don't have to kick the same way anymore. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we just need to have this larger discussion about what labor practices in academia look like, because it is true. I don't have the exact stats right now, but it's 3/4 of the jobs are not tenure track. They're not tenure track jobs. And it's not, well, medievalists, they're just not tenure track jobs. And it's across the board. There are major, major labor issues. Within history departments, and it's probably the same elsewhere, you're talking about teaching rhetoric. I'm the pre-modernist. That's it. It's me, you know, and I'm lucky to have that tenure track job, but it's, you know, it's such a massive, massive labor issue. And it's really only now that some of the big societies are kind of like, oh, no, we do actually need to talk about this as a labor issue, because I mean, the AHA just this year is like, oh, we really do need to do something about this, because it's not just medieval studies. It's really across the board. It's really who has access to the academy at all, you know, and this is and it's outside of academia as well, in terms of how of our country and work and how labor works in general.
Yeah.
All right, we have several other questions here. So this one at you. Could I ask about how anti-Semitism in medieval studies overlaps with racism and discrimination against BIPOC? Is there a lot of intersection and they want to be added to any kind of future mailing lists? They are happy with the webinar.
Does anyone want to go, or should I just go start? So, I mean, maybe the clarification of the question is the clarification of the question in relationship to now, or like in the discussion of our materials from the past? I think maybe just generally in clarification of the now. I think there are multiple ways in which structural discrimination happens, right? That aren't necessarily structural racism. So this would be also structural homophobia and trans misogyny, as well as anti-Semitism. And, you know, we can kind of work through some of the lists. I would say that, you know, there's a whole discussion about the intersections, at least in relationship to anti-Semitism, in relationship to intersectionality and Jews of color, right? So, and I think similarly, there are discussions in, you know, how Islamophobia works, right? Like how that works in relationship to who gets more the compounded harm question, right? If you are Ilhan Omar and a Black Muslim woman, that is even more intensified, the Islamophobia, because of the intersections of gender and race, right? So I think it also probably is attendant on what part of the world you're in relationship to a discussion of it, like what it looks like in North America versus what it looks like in Europe, you know, what it looks like in other parts of the world. So I think there are like these local questions, if that makes sense. I hope that's like a start. So I think there are like coalitions and ways to build, to think through a lot of the various kinds of structural discrimination, right? And I think that is a discussion that we can all have.
If I understand, I'll share this. We've been trying to develop a program on the medical humanities, right? And part of why we've been trying to develop a program on medical humanities to try to address this intersection of maybe Jewish diasporic work and African diasporic work, right? One of the reasons why we've been trying to develop this program on medical humanities is when it comes to interrogation and investigation of, say, something like the Holocaust, with regards to, as dastardly as the event was, in the West, we have gleaned the materials from the Nazis and the Holocaust to great advantage in our medical field, right? From everything from hypothermia and so on and so forth. But we occlude the work that was done, particularly on Black female slaves within the field of, what is it? I can't pronounce it, OBGYN, right? Obstetric, my wife beats me up, right? And so we've been trying to promote a more inclusive approach to studies of medical humanities that might broaden the field to an extent that might take more consideration of things like the Tuskegee experiments and the experiments that were done on Black females and the body snatchers up in places in the Northeast around schools like Princeton and Harvard and Yale for their medical programs. And so for me, that is where, with regards to, you know, any approaches to, I don't want to call it anti-Semitism, but approaches to how we look at perhaps Jewish historiography and perhaps how we look at Black and African American historiography, how we could broaden some of our approaches a little bit to the benefit of the medical humanities, and also some of our medical students who are sometimes not necessarily finding a place for themselves within the disparate medical fields. If we could broaden these boundaries a little bit, perhaps that would increase their interest. So.
I also wanted to briefly mention that in sort of the you know, the popularized like far right discussions that we see the use of the Middle Ages, what you often see is certainly a lot of like straightforward anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic language used with Islamophobic language. But one of the things that I've also been observing is how medieval anti-Semitic narratives are being taken in their structure, like medieval blood libel, and yet the figures are being replaced, whether it be with pedophiles, homosexuals, whatever the enemy of the day is. So you have these like these flexibilities of anti-Semitism and how it manifests itself that also require actually very well-versed scholars in medieval iterations of anti-Semitism to also parse out the ways in which it is being used as a sort of template that has, of course, its roots not only in the Middle Ages, but its reuses and so forth in the 20th century with the Holocaust and the Nazis. So that's, I think, also another important prong in this investigation, that really a lot of work needs to be done there as well and taken seriously. Yeah.
You know what, Roland, you make me think of a conversation my students were having, and it's kind of tangential to it. I don't know if you all are familiar with the hullabaloo that blew up around Nick Cannon, and he got his television show and stuff taken away from him, right? Okay, so at any rate, Nick Cannon, Black guy, okay, he makes an anti-Semitic mark, according to many, right? But what it stems from is Nick Cannon's understanding of the 5%er culture that exists in New York and in other various enclaves throughout America. And so the point I was getting to, Roland, was your point of this kind of swapping out of figures, right? Nick has found himself embroiled in a situation where his commentary, although it's ignorant commentary and he should have educated himself more, he's found himself in a situation where he's been swapped out, right? He is being swapped out, and the anti-Semitism that actually exists in America is being reposited and deposited onto him. And now he's finding himself responsible for hundreds of years of anti-Semitism that came nowhere near him. And then the ironic thing about it is, we just discovered a few weeks ago that he has Jewish people in his family. So this thing is just really going all over the place. But I come to it because it made us have a discussion on certain Black ideologies focused on Jewishness, the 12 tribes, and authenticity, and so on and so forth. And anybody who's walked around the streets of New York know about the 5%ers and their position on it. I'm not here to critique it one way or another, because my father used to be a temple builder for the Nation of Islam. So what I will say is I'm quite aware of it, and I'm practicing something else, right? And I'll just leave it at that.
Terrell, we actually have a question for you.
Okay.
All right. Let's see here. First, thank you to all the organizers and panelists of today's session. I resonated in particular with Terrell's talk. A fellow Black medievalist, I have often encountered resistance to the crossing of disciplinary boundaries and questions about the object of my study. So I really want to thank you for sharing your experience. My question is, how do you deal with anti-Blackness within groups/spaces for people of color more broadly?
Oh, I don't know, but I'll give it a shot, right? I'll give you the before and the after. I did not handle it well when I was a younger scholar. I just didn't. When I was out at Stanford, I ran with a lot of ex-Panthers. I had the opportunity to be somewhat mentored by Angela Davis. And so I was really staunch in my positions of making sure that you recognize and respect where I was coming from. And I'm not saying that that was bad or anything like that. I'm saying it did not work for me well in the environment that I found myself in when I got my first jobs. I was in the midst of a very wealthy, very elitist, very conservative, very white atmosphere. And it was oil and water. And so it took me some time to learn how to navigate these spaces in order to bring topics to the forefront that I thought were of importance. And as Dorothy has mentioned before, there was a lot of fugitivity involved in that. Quite frankly, I had to look through the lenses of double consciousness and strategize and plan and plot and recognize what battles were worth having at any particular time and which ones could be put on the back burner for later. There was nothing magical about it. There's been a lot of mistakes made along the way. There's been many jobs left along the way. It just so happens that you are finding me at a time where some of the places where this Black body exists are more accepting and welcoming of this Black body and what it has to say. And even then, the vestiges of anti-Blackness, particularly with regards to medieval studies, still rears its head. And I just try to navigate around those things as much as possible. I learned a while ago that sometimes making a plan is to be revised. Sometimes the way you believe and want things to take place, they don't necessarily work out that way, but there's still ways for you to attain your goals. And so I just have a deep faith in there is a way to accomplish the thing. It does not have to be the way that I might most desire it to take place, but there is a way. And if I can be okay with the end goal being the purpose, then how I get there sometimes I've grown to not let that bother me as much. I'm not saying it doesn't bother me. I'm not saying that I don't have days where I am at home crying, but I've had enough heartache to know what that feels like, and I like the other side a little better. So if for every Belle de Costa I get, I have to stomach through 9 experiences like my first teaching job, I like to think that I'm to a point to where I'd be willing to stomach that to get to the Belle de Costa. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but in the long or short, to not make you feel too depressed, I don't know if there's a way to escape it. Perhaps there is a way to be able to confront it and still have some integrity and ethos about yourself. So I hope that helped.
Thank you. This one's for Nicole. Nicole, could you share the reference for the and pass rates in core classes? Maybe you can send that to Lisa, and she can put it in the chat. And someone else asked, are there stats on the number of grad students of color who did not find positions in the field upon or shortly after graduation? Because we know it's not because they aren't as passionate as those who did find positions. Anybody know offhand?
All of mine is anecdotal. Just because of the people who I come in contact with.
I think it's mostly anecdotal. I think that this is like an institution, scholarly or kind of question, right? And it's really about doing some version of like equity audits or sort of trying to find this information, exit interviews if people are willing. So it's a good question. And I think a lot of it is anecdotal at this point.
Nicole, I think this one is kind of for you as well. Um, thank you to all the speakers and the MAA. This is probably one of the first times as a Latina medievalist that I feel recognized and represented. Why don't you study medieval Spain has certainly been a resonating question throughout my career and completely dismisses my studies on identity. One question for Nicole and everyone else. My courses are heavily based on primary source readings, and I've always been interested in promoting and providing non-English materials for students, but have ultimately failed to come up with classroom exercises to do so. So my question is this: what sort of activities or assignments do you recommend to allow and encourage non-native English speakers to use their linguistic skills? Do you have specific examples of their success, both in helping students of color recognize themselves in history and for white students to identify these skills as valuable? Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, this is more, I do this more with teaching modern history because there's just so much stuff. The themes of rebellion and, I'm teaching a writing intensive course. But so a lot of the students can choose a list of like, there's, a list of events of revolts and rebellions, and they do the research in whatever language they are comfortable in. And so a lot of them are interested in rebellions in, where their family is from. And so they actually do have an advantage in doing that primary source research. I can help them find, newspapers and things like that are primary sources. But that's been very successful, though it is it's also, with Spanish, I'm a heritage speaker. With other Romance languages, I know it, but we've had to kind of navigate a little bit because I don't know Chinese, I don't know Arabic, but I'm letting them do it. My kind of ground rule has been that they have to translate the name of the source into English, and that's everyone, even languages that I speak. And we talk about how they found the primary source. But there's a lot of trust there. You have to give your students a lot of trust. And this is my second time doing this. So, we teach them how to find primary sources in general. And, from the Global Middle Ages website and other things, like they can find things that aren't in English. Or, if you work on that topic, you can also help them with that. But a lot of it is like, all right, well, here's how you do scholarship, read some of the secondary scholarship, or help them with some of the secondary scholarship and tracking down the sources in the original language. But it is, it's hard to do, particularly for undergrads, particularly with pre-modern, because all of the, things are published then in English, assuming an English audience. With the modern, it's easier just in the sense that you have digitized newspapers and things like that. And so that's really where I'm doing that more often than not.
If I could just add something very briefly, that I think that this is also a really important exercise. I've been doing this with my Byzantine art class because there are a lot of great sources published on Byzantine art in Spanish. And at a HSI, at a Hispanic Serving Institution, we have a lot of students who have heritage knowledge of Spanish. And one of the things that's so important here is also that, the vocabulary building to be able to discuss in a language that you might know very well, these academic issues, is very important. Something that I struggle with. If you put me to lecture in Spanish, oh gosh, my art historical terms might suddenly give out, even as a fluent Spanish native speaker. And so that's something also, I think it's an important service to our students to also expose them just to the technical language that they would have no other opportunity to gain really than in those types of experiences. Yeah, just very briefly.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. I think it's a good ending question. For the panel, what is the single most important specific action that the MAA should take at this point to address the issues raised in today's presentations?
I mean, generally dismantle that white supremacist pyramid, right? Really think about like were organized as like a white racial organization. And so what are they gonna do structurally and everything else to like turn that around, right? So generally.
Possible. I think it was Roland who hit upon this. Is it possible for the MAA? Is it desirable for the MAA to do any high school programming? Do we do high school programming? What I heard.
Would you like me to, you want me to jump in there? I can respond to that really quick if you want. So yes, we do. We have a whole K through 12 committee that is working on programming primarily at our annual meeting here I could even put my camera on, that is working on programming at our annual meeting for local K through 12 educators to help them learn how to embrace a broader vision of the Middle Ages. And to expand their curricula. And we're also developing, and Aphrodisia has been instrumental in this, as well as Monica Green and Kisha Tracy, an online multi-week course with the National Humanities Center on Africa and Africans in the Middle Ages. That's specifically targeting K through 12 educators, and we'll be opening registration for that in just a few weeks. The development of that is nearly complete. So we're definitely trying to engage with K through 12 educators and K through 12 curricula. It's a tough nut to crack because state guidelines are kind of immutable, but we're trying to help educators find ways that they can still meet the standard they're supposed to meet while embracing a broader vision of the Middle Ages.
Well, we should.
Thank you. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'll leave it to you to wrap it up, Aphrodisia. Thank you all very much, and thank you to all of the attendees as well.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for their contributions, and again, thank the Medieval Academy and Geraldine Hank for suggesting that we do this. The webinar is being recorded, so there will be a recording up on the website if you didn't catch it all, or you want to see it all over again, or you know somebody who might be interested in listening to what the panelists had to say. Other than that, have a good weekend, everyone, and again, Happy New Year.